My name is Marie, and I need to start with the wallet, not with Alice, not with my father, not with the afternoon I found her standing in our kitchen making coffee like she had every right to be there, which she did not, but which she seemed to have decided was not worth thinking about. I need to start with the wallet because the wallet is the thing that made everything else fall into place. And if I don't start there, you will spend this entire story waiting for it. And you deserve to know from the beginning what kind of story this is. My father died on a Wednesday in October. He was 61 years old, which is too young by any honest measure, and the heart attack came without warning, fast, definitive, the kind that doesn't leave time for last conversations or careful goodbyes. We were all unprepared in the complete and total way that you are unprepared when someone is simply there and then not there, when the structure of a life disappears between one moment and the next. My mother called me at 6 a.m. I don't remember exactly what she said. I remember the tone more than the words, the specific quality of her voice when she told me, which was controlled in a way that sounded like it was costing her something significant to maintain. I was on a plane by 9. I spent the flight with my hands in my lap and my eyes on the seat back in front of me and the pretzels untouched, thinking in the way grief makes you think, circular and incomplete, landing on the same questions without answering them and then returning to them again. The last time I had talked to my father was a Sunday, 4 days earlier. We had talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, my job, a project he was working on, a book he'd read. I had said, I love you when we hung up because I always said, I love you when we hung up. And he had said it back because he always did. I sat on the plane and was grateful for that. And it didn't feel like enough. And I knew it was going to have to be. The service was 5 days later. My mother handled most of it. Carrie has always been the kind of person who moves through grief by managing it, by translating the unbearable into logistics, into tasks with completion points. The flowers were exactly right. The music was the music he would have chosen. The reception afterward had the food he loved, which she had spent 2 days sourcing and arranging because doing so gave her somewhere to put the energy that had nowhere else to go. About 70 people came. Colleagues from his architectural firm, neighbors from the street where we'd lived for 20 years, family, friends I had known my whole life, and people I had never met, the version of my father that existed outside of my knowledge of him, the self that went to work and had lunch with people and built relationships in rooms I had never entered. There are always people at a funeral who remind you that the person you lost was also a person you only partially knew, that the love you had for them existed alongside versions of them you never had access to. Alice was one of those people. She stood near the back of the room during the service. I noticed her because she was crying, not in the restrained, appropriate way of someone who knew the deceased professionally and has come to pay respects. That kind of grief has a particular quality to it, contained, respectful, aware of its place in the hierarchy of loss. This was different. This was the private, unguarded kind of crying that happens when you forget yourself, when the grief is large enough that it temporarily overcomes the management of how it looks. She was not performing. She was simply in it, in a way that seemed, from where I was sitting, to be more than the situation strictly accounted for. After the service, at the reception in my parents' house, she found me. She said her name was Alice. She said she had known my father for years. They worked in the same building, different firms. She was an interior designer. He was an architect. Their offices shared a floor, and they had become friends over a decade of proximity. She said he was one of the kindest people she had ever known. She said she was so very sorry for my loss. She had warm eyes. She was in her mid-40s, dark hair, the kind of face that is careful without being cold. She squeezed my hand when she said she was sorry. I thanked her. She moved on through the room. I registered her the way you register people at funerals briefly, in the context of crowd and grief, filing her under people who knew my father in ways I didn't, and then moved to the next person. I did not think about Alice again for 3 weeks. Then I found the wallet. My mother had asked me to stay for a while, and I had longer than I'd planned because leaving felt wrong, because the house felt like it needed people in it, because my mother needed, even if she wouldn't say so directly, for someone to be there. 2 weeks after the funeral, I was still at the house, working remotely, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, learning to exist in the rooms alongside her absence that was somehow also a presence. She asked me to go through some of the surface things: the bedside table, the bathroom cabinet, the closet shelf, not the big decisions, not his tools, not his drafting materials, not the things that required real thought about what to keep and what to let go. Just the layer of objects that accumulate in the spaces closest to a person and that need to be cleared before you can begin to breathe normally in the room again. I started with the bedside table. The drawer held the ordinary things: reading glasses he didn't always remember to use, a phone charger, a paperback he'd been halfway through, some loose change, a watch that needed a new battery. I set things aside. I move methodically the way I do when I need something to do with my hands. At the back of the drawer, behind a small notebook I didn't open, was a wallet. Not the one he'd been using daily that had come back to us in a hospital bag with his watch and his phone. The objects of a person's last hours assembled into a plastic bag with his name on the label. This was an older wallet, brown leather, the color darkened and softened by years of handling, worn smooth at the corners, the stitching frayed in places. The kind of thing that develops a specific presence over time that holds the shape of how it's been used. He'd replaced it at some point, but kept it. My father kept things past their practical usefulness because letting go of them felt to him like a small dismissal of what they'd been. I had always found this slightly endearing. I opened it. Inside, a gas station rewards card, the points long expired. A business card from a restaurant that I would later look up and find had closed 7 years ago, 2 receipts I didn't read, and tucked into the slip behind the card holder, a photograph, folded once down the middle, the fold worn to softness from being opened and refolded many times over a long period. I unfolded it. It was Alice. Not a snapshot from an office party, not a candid group photo, a portrait taken intentionally, in good light, of a woman who knew she was being photographed and was looking directly at the camera. She was younger in it by 10 years at least, but unmistakably her. The same face I had watched cry at my father's funeral. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in my father's handwriting, the handwriting I had known since I was old enough to read, the slanted, careful print of someone who had spent a career producing precise technical drawings, was a single word: always. I stood in my parents' bedroom holding my dead father's old wallet with Alice's photograph inside it, and I felt the floor shift in the specific way floors shift when something you believed was solid reveals that it was not. I stood there for a long time. Then I put the photograph back inside the fold. I put the wallet back in the drawer. I closed the drawer. I went downstairs and I filled the kettle, and I stood at the kitchen counter while it boiled, and I did not think about anything directly, the way you sometimes have to approach things obliquely because looking at them straight on is too much. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. My mother was in the garden. I watched her through the window, moving between the rose bushes with the focused, unhurried energy she brings to tasks that give her hands something to do. I did not tell her, not yet, not until I understood what I was holding, not until I knew what I was going to need to say. But before I get to that, before I get to what I found and what I did with it, I need to tell you who these people were. Because the photograph doesn't mean anything without the context of what I believed about my family before I found it. And what I believed was this, that my parents had a real marriage, a good one that had been built over decades and held together through the ordinary weight of a shared life. I need to tell you why I believe that, because I wasn't naive. I wasn't a child who only saw what she was shown. I was a 31-year-old woman who had watched her parents carefully for her entire life, and what I had seen was two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other, and I had believed that was the whole story. It was not the whole story. Let me tell you about my parents. Because without the context of what I thought their marriage was, the rest of this doesn't land the way it should. Mark and Carrie met in their mid-20s. My mother tells the story precisely the host's name, the dress she was wearing, the song that was playing when my father crossed the room toward her. My father used to tell it differently, a looser version, funnier, in which he had noticed her early in the evening and spent the better part of an hour talking himself into going over, and then had said entirely the wrong thing when he did, and she had laughed at him, and somehow that had worked better than any right thing would have. 34 years, a house, a daughter. 2 decades in the same neighborhood, the same friends, the rhythms and habits and private languages that develop between people who have spent that much time in proximity. My father brought her coffee in the morning, every morning, without being asked. My mother kept track of the birthdays of everyone in his family because he was constitutionally incapable of remembering them himself, a limitation he acknowledged freely and she had long since absorbed as simply part of the landscape of him. They had a running joke between them, long enough running that neither of them could any longer remember the original setup, which had itself become part of the joke. They held hands at movies. Still, after 30 years, I remember noticing that as a teenager and finding it both embarrassing and, privately, reassuring. They were not a perfect marriage. I don't think I believed, even before all of this, that such a thing existed, but they were a real one, or so I had always understood. The kind that is made of actual daily decisions, actual accommodations, actual sustained choice, the kind that weathers things, the kind that lasts. I had believed this completely. The photograph in the wallet was asking me to believe something else. I drove home 2 weeks after the funeral, back to my apartment and my job and the ordinary life that had continued without me while I'd been gone. I had left the wallet where I found it. I had left everything where I found it because I did not know yet what to do with any of it. I told my mother I would call her every day, and I did. We talked about small things, how she was sleeping, what she was eating, whether she had talked to her sister. I listened for what was underneath the surface of the conversation, and I could not always tell what was there. Grief is not a simple thing. I want to say that clearly because I don't want to flatten it into something it wasn't. I was genuinely, deeply grieving my father. He was my father, and I had loved him my whole life, and he was gone, and that was real, and it was constant, and it was separate from the photograph, even though they were happening at the same time, even though some nights I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. But the photograph was also real, and it sat in my mind the way unsolved things sit, not loudly, but persistently, the way a low sound is sometimes harder to ignore than a loud one because you can never quite stop being aware of it. I found Alice on LinkedIn. It was easy. Her name was distinctive and her profile was public, and her employer was listed as the firm in the building where my father had worked for a decade. Interior designer, which matched what she had told me at the funeral. Her profile photo confirmed with complete certainty that she was the same woman. I stared at her profile for a long time. I read the summary. I looked at the connections they had in common. 3 people from the architectural world, people who had worked in that building. I closed the laptop and opened it again and looked at the profile again, as if looking at it more times would tell me something different. It did not tell me something different. It told me the same thing it had told me the first time. I did not message her, not yet. I needed more ground under me before I could do that. I called my Aunt Patricia, my father's older sister, 4 years his senior, the keeper of family history, the person who remembered everything and had opinions about all of it, and was generally the last person to be careful with information she had decided needed to be known. She is a forthright woman. She has always been a forthright woman. She considers excessive discretion a form of cowardice and has said so. I told her I was calling to check in. We talked about the funeral, about how my mother was doing, about various family members and how they were holding up. I let the conversation find its natural rhythm, and then, as carefully as I could, I said, "Did Dad ever mention someone named Alice? From work, maybe?" The silence that followed was not Patricia's usual behavior. Patricia does not do silence. Patricia fills silence the way water fills a container immediately, completely, taking the shape of whatever space is available. She believes pauses in conversation are problems to be solved. She had been this way for as long as I could remember. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then she said, "Where did you hear that name?" 3 seconds of silence from Patricia was the equivalent of a full confession from most people. I said, "I found something of Dad's." She said, "What did you find?" I told her. "Not everything." I told her about the wallet and the photograph. She was quiet again, shorter this time. Then she said, "I see." And then she started talking. She talked for a long time. She talked the way people talk when they have been holding something alone for a very long time and have finally been given permission to set it down. Alice had been part of my father's life for 14 years. 14 years. I was 31. I counted backwards. 17. I was 17 years old when whatever this was had begun, when my father had started something that would last, apparently, until the last years of his life. Patricia had known for 7 of those 14 years. My father had told her during a single conversation. She was precise about this, careful to frame it as one conversation, one window into something she mostly had not been allowed to see. He had been, she said, at some kind of breaking point. Not a decision point, necessarily. She didn't think he was trying to decide anything. More like the weight of it had become too much to carry without telling someone, and she was there, and she was his sister, and so he had told her. She had listened. She had said very little in response, she told me, because she had not known what to say. She had kept it for 7 years. I asked her, "Does my mother know?" She said, "I don't know." I asked, "Does Alice know about us? About my mother?" She said, "Yes, yes." Simple, direct, unambiguous. Alice knew. Had known for 14 years. She had walked through the rooms of my parents' marriage with full knowledge of what those rooms contained. She had come to my father's funeral and cried real tears and looked me in the eye and told me he was one of the kindest people she had ever met. She had held my hand briefly when she said she was sorry. And she had known all of it, every day, for 14 years. I flew back the following weekend. I told my mother I wanted to spend more time with her, which was true. I did not tell her what I was coming to say. On the second evening, after dinner, I told her I had found the wallet in the bedside drawer. She didn't ask which wallet. She set down her tea carefully, the way you set something down when you need both hands free for whatever comes next. I said there was a photograph inside it. of a woman named Alice. My mother looked at the table. I said, Mom? She said, I know. 34 years of marriage, 14 years of a secret inside those 34 years. And the thing she said was, I know. I said, how long have you known? She said, 4 years. I did the math. 4 years before he died, which meant she had known for 4 years and had stayed, which meant they had had another 4 years together inside this knowledge, and she had chosen to be in those years. I said, you stayed. She said, it's complicated, Marie. I said, tell me anyway. And she did. She had found out the way people find out things they weren't meant to find out, a phone left in the wrong place, a message visible for just long enough. She had confronted my father. He had not denied it. There had been a period, she said, that was the worst of her life, worse than losing her own mother, worse than anything she had experienced before, and she described it carefully, giving me the shape of it without the details she decided I didn't need, protecting me even now, even in this, from the worst of what she'd been through. He had said he would end it. She chose to believe him. She chose, after months of the worst period of her life, to stay in the marriage, not because she had no options, not because she had nowhere to go, because she loved him, which had not disappeared even though something had broken, and because the life they had was real, even though something inside it had been false, and because she made a calculation that is deeply personal and that I am not in a position to judge even when part of me wants to, she said, I chose to believe in what we had, not in what he did. Those are different things. I said, is that enough to keep them separate? She said, I don't know, but it was the choice I made. I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked, did he end it? She took a long time to answer. Then she said, I believe he tried. I heard what she wasn't saying. I heard the difference between he ended it and he tried. I heard 4 years of living inside that distinction. The photograph in the wallet was old, worn from being opened. He had kept it in a wallet he no longer used, somewhere she might not find it again after the first time. He had kept it and written always on the back, present tense. And always that had no end date I could identify. What do you do with that? I have had a long time to sit with it, and I do not have a complete answer. My father is dead. Whatever the interior of this was for him, whatever conflict or love or failure or all three simultaneously, he took it with him. I have fragments, enough to know the shape of something, not enough to know everything inside it. I called Alice. I want to be clear about why. Not to punish her, not exactly or not only. I needed to hear her voice when I said his name. I needed to see from her direction what this had been. My mother's version was filtered through my mother's grief and my mother's choices. Patricia's version was filtered through a single conversation 7 years ago and what she had reconstructed from it over the years. I needed a third point to triangulate from. I needed to hear it from Alice herself, in her own words, without a filter. I had her number from the letter she'd sent. She had included it at the bottom with a note that said I didn't have to use it, but that she would answer if I did. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time before I called. I made tea. I didn't drink. I walked from the kitchen to the living room and back. I called on a Thursday evening, sitting at the kitchen table in my apartment with the window dark and the lamp on and the tea going cold. She answered on the third ring. I said, "This is Marie." She was quiet for a long moment, a real pause. Then she said, "I wondered if you would call." "I hoped you would." I said, "I found the photograph in his wallet." She said, "I know which one." Of course she did. She knew exactly which one. She had been in that photograph, had probably been there when it was taken, knew the day and the context and everything that surrounded it. She had been in my father's bedside drawer for years, folded in a worn leather wallet, and she knew exactly which one. I said, I need you to tell me what this was. She said, what do you want to know? I said, everything you're willing to tell me. So she told me. She told me carefully. And I believe she told me less than the full truth, not because she was lying, but because some things belonged to what they had been, and she was protecting them. The way you protect something you loved, even when you're describing it to someone who has reason to be angry. I understood that. I let her have it. She had loved him. She said it plainly in the first minute without softening it or hedging it. 14 years. She had loved him for 14 years, and she wanted me to know that first because everything else came from that, and she thought I deserved to understand what the thing actually was rather than what it might look like from the outside. She said she had tried to end it. Twice, she said. She had walked away twice, the first time after about 2 years, when she had looked at what it was and decided she couldn't be the person who did this. She had stopped returning his calls. She had gone 6 months without contact. And then he had come back, not dramatically, not with grand gestures, but slowly and quietly in the way that some re-entries happen, with patience and ordinary conversation until the conversation became something else again, and she had let it. The second time was after 5 years. She had ended it, more decisively told him it was finished, that she couldn't continue, that it was wrong, and she knew it was wrong, and she was going to commit to that knowledge. He had accepted it, she said. He had not come back immediately. But eventually, she said, eventually, without specifying how long eventually was he had, and she had let him. She said, I was not strong enough to keep the door closed. Twice I tried, and twice I couldn't do it. I have to live with that. I said, my mother knew. Did you know that? She said, I suspected. There was a period, about 4 years before he died, when things changed. He was different. He told me they had talked eventually without saying much about what had been said. I understood what that meant. I said, she chose to stay. Alice said, I know. I said, while this was still happening, she was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had ended it. When he told me about their conversation, he said he had ended it with me. I think he believed that when he said it, I heard what she wasn't saying. I thought about the photograph in the wallet, the worn fold, the word on the back of it. I said, were you in our house? The quiet that followed was different from the other quiets, heavier, more deliberate. I said, did you have a key? She said, yes. I said, when my mother wasn't home? She said, yes. I let that sit between us for a moment. The house where I grew up, the kitchen where my father made coffee in the mornings, the rooms where my parents' life happened, the visible life, the one I had believed was the whole life. Alice had been in those rooms. She had had a key. She had walked through that house while my mother was somewhere else, not knowing or knowing and choosing not to. I said, I need to go. She said, Marie, I said, I need to go now. I hung up. I set the phone on the table. I looked at my cold tea for a while. I want to tell you that the phone call gave me clarity, that hearing her voice and her version of events organized something in my mind and allowed me to arrive at a settled place. It didn't exactly. What it did was fill in some of the outline, give dimension to a shape I had only been seeing in silhouette. The interior of it, what it had meant to my father, what it had cost him, what kind of person he was inside it, that I still don't have. He took the interior with him. What I had after that call was this: 14 years, 2 attempts to end it that hadn't held, a key, a photograph worn from being opened, a single word in my father's handwriting. And my mother, 4 years ago, choosing to stay, I drove back to her house that weekend. I sat across from her at the kitchen table and I told her everything I had found out. Not everything I knew. I kept the key. I kept Alice having been in the house. I made that decision and I stand by it. But everything else, Patricia, the timeline, the conversation with Alice, my mother listened. She sat very still while I talked, in the way she sits still when she is managing something from the inside, the particular stillness of a person who has learned to hold things without showing the effort. When I was finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I should have told you." I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't know how." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you think less of him?" I sat with that question for a long time. I turned it over. I looked at it from different angles. I said, "I think differently of him. I don't know yet if that's less." She nodded. She got up and refilled the kettle and stood at the counter with her back to me for a moment, and I didn't say anything. And then she turned around and sat back down, and we stayed in the kitchen together for another hour without talking very much, which was its own kind of conversation. I want to tell you that what followed was clean, that I processed it and arrived at clarity and found a place to stand that felt stable. That would be a better story. What actually happened was messier and slower and is still, honestly, ongoing. I went back to my mother after that weekend conversation, and we sat at the kitchen table and we talked for a long time, not just that night, but over the following months in pieces, in the way things get talked about when they're too large for a single conversation. We talked about who my father was, the full version, the one that held warmth and failure in the same person simultaneously without trying to resolve the contradiction between them. My mother said things I had not expected her to say. She said, "I knew who he was when I married him, not about Alice. I didn't know about Alice, but I knew he was a person who needed things I couldn't always give him. Space, I think, in some way I couldn't fully name, room to be someone outside of what we were together. I thought I knew how to make space for that. I was wrong in ways it took me years to understand. I said, "That doesn't make it your fault." She said, "I know. I'm not saying it's my fault. I'm saying it's more complicated than fault." She said, "He was a good father." I need you to hear that from me because I know you're trying to sort him out right now, trying to figure out how to carry what you know alongside what you already had. He was a good father that was real. What he failed at with me was real. They were both real and they were both him. I said, "How do you hold both?" She said, "Badly, for a while, then better. It takes time." I said, "Are you angry?" She thought about it. She said, "I was. For years, in different ways. Right after I found out, and then again after he died, when the grief mixed with everything else and became something I couldn't name cleanly. I'm less angry now. Not because I've forgiven everything. I don't think forgiveness is the right word for what I've done with it. More like I've accepted that he was a whole person, and the whole person was mine for 34 years, and I am not willing to hand all of that back because one part of it was false." I said, "The photograph said always." She was quiet. I said, "He kept it until he died." She said, "I know." I said, "What does that mean to you?" She said, "I don't know." I've asked myself that question many times. I think it means he loved her. I think he loved me too. I think some people have a larger capacity for love than they have integrity, and he was one of those people. And I chose him knowing he was complicated, and I would choose him again because the parts I chose were real. I sat with that for a long time. I think about it still. That formulation, a larger capacity for love than for integrity, and whether it's a condemnation or an explanation or something that doesn't map cleanly onto either of those categories. Alice sent me a letter 3 months after our phone call. Handwritten, 3 pages, careful and formal in the way that handwriting is when someone has sat with it for a long time before committing anything to paper. I read it once, slowly, in the kitchen on a Sunday morning. She said she was sorry. She said it multiple times and in multiple ways, and I believed her in the way you believe someone who is saying something it costs them to say. She said that she had spent 14 years telling herself a story about what it was and what it meant and why it was different from what it looked like, and that she knew now that the story had not been honest. She said she had loved him completely and she knew that didn't excuse anything and she wasn't using it as an excuse. She said, I hope you can keep him. I hope you can find a way to keep who he was to you. I put the letter away. I've not read it again. I may at some point. I may not. My mother and I are closer now than we were before she told me. That sounds strange, I know. But there is an honesty between us that wasn't possible before, not because she was dishonest exactly, but because she was carrying something heavy and alone, and now she isn't. She knows that I know the real version of her marriage. I know that she made a choice I might not have been able to make, and I am trying genuinely and imperfectly to understand it on its own terms rather than on mine. We visit more often than we used to. She has started gardening, something she never did before, something my father had always handled. She says it gives her something to do with her hands that doesn't require her to think too much. She is okay. She is not okay. She is both, which is the honest answer for most people most of the time, and I have stopped expecting anything cleaner than that from either of us. I kept the photograph. It is in a drawer in my apartment. I don't look at it often. I couldn't throw it away. It is part of who my father was, the part I didn't know, the part that existed alongside the part I did, the part that wore wallets down to softness and wrote always on the backs of photographs and kept things past their usefulness because letting them go felt like a small betrayal of what they'd been. He was my father. He was more complicated than I needed him to be, and exactly as complicated as he actually was. I am still learning what to do with that. I expect I will be learning for a while. Some mornings I drink my coffee and I think about him bringing it to her, and I feel the whole contradiction of that without trying to resolve it. Some days the grief is just the grief. Some days it has this other thing in it. I let it be both. That is what I have. It is not a clean ending. It is just where I am. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done. Fireside Stories. New episodes 3 to 4 times each week. I'll see you at the next one.